Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week is slightly different, as although I am still covering historic crime stories, this week I am covering many different stories, all from 1 week at the Durham assizes back in 1843. Now, some of the stories will be quite short and basic, and others will be a little longer, and I very much doubt that I would have been able to cover every single case, as it would have taken far too long, but I hope you will still find the video interesting. In the spring of 1843, Mr. Justice Rolfe arrived in Durham for that month's cases. Before any trial took place, he addressed the jury, who for the main part would be hearing all of the cases. He spoke to them, telling them he feared they would be busy for a lot longer than usual that week. They had around 100 cases to hear. He stated that he did not feel any of the cases were of a distressing nature, and he did not feel that Durham had more criminals than any other area in the UK. It was simply that the smaller cases had built up, making it seem worse than usual. He stated that there was one case of wilful murder which had taken place in the Castle Eden area, but he did not feel this was a difficult case, and I hoped to cover that case in full at a later date. Amazing, I made a mistake before I've even got to the bit where I tell you that I sometimes make mistakes. Never mind. He said he felt that apart from this one murder case, the jury would deal with them all easily. He then indicated that he was ready for the first case to be heard. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do find this video interesting, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is very much appreciated, and it is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do, like I said before, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. The first case of the day was a man by the name of Peter Curry, who was said to be 22 years old and from Sunderland. He had been arrested for stealing some boots. The case was short and sweet, with no real details in the paper, and Peter was found guilty and given a 4 months penal servitude with hard labour. Next came John Collins and Sarah Bosca, both of Durham. John had been charged with stealing blankets, linen and clothing, and Sarah had been charged with knowingly taking stolen items and paying for them. It was said that at the time many men had come into Durham in the hope of finding work on the railways, and suddenly people were finding their clothes missing from washing lines at an alarming rate. And it seems that the police were notified that Sarah Bosca was taking these items and paying the men for them. The police visited her house and found many of the stolen items hidden under some coal, with Sarah telling them that the men brought them to her on a regular basis. John Collins was one of her lodgers, and when his shoes had been checked with prints found in a garden where clothes had been stolen, they matched perfectly. Both were found guilty, however no details of their punishment was mentioned, nor any details of any other men who may have been involved in the washing line thefts. Next came Ellen Armstrong of Durham. She was found guilty of stealing a sheet and was given a 6 weeks penal servitude with hard labour, and Elmore Thompson of Hartlepool found himself sentenced to 6 weeks penal servitude with hard labour for stealing a coat. A young boy by the name of William Hartley, who was only 13 years old, had been accused of stealing a pair of boots. He too was quickly found guilty and was sentenced to 4 months penal servitude with hard labour, and more shockingly, he was sentenced to be privately whipped. Now this I found incredibly harsh, and it is likely that he was stealing the boots to either wear or to sell for food. George Nottingham of Sunderland was found guilty of stealing some rope belonging to John Byrne, and he was sent to prison for 4 months with hard labour. Leonora Clarkson, also of Sunderland, was found guilty of stealing a hat and was sent to prison for 3 months with hard labour. Both again seem very harsh punishments for the crimes committed. Archibald Paxton of Durham was charged with having caused the death of George Clark. This case was to be tried as a case of manslaughter. The jury were told that while driving a horse-drawn omnibus while going downhill, Archibald had knocked down 2 men, and this had resulted in the death of George Clark. The doctor stated it was most definitely the fall and blow from the bus that had been the cause of George's death, and evidence was given to suggest that Archibald had turned his view away from the road just before he hit the 2 men and had not been paying attention to his work. The judge spoke to the jury, saying he did not feel there was enough evidence for the case to proceed under a charge of manslaughter, and as the prosecution had stated that he had no strong evidence, they should return a verdict of not guilty. Now, oddly, the jury did not seem to agree, and after a brief discussion, they wished to retire to discuss the case further. The judge said if they wished to do this, they must hear more of the case and hear what Archibald had to say in his defence. He then repeated that they should find him not guilty. This time, the jury, without much further discussion, did as the judge asked, and Archibald was free to go, and George Clark's death was recorded as accidental. James Tuke was found guilty of having obtained 8 pairs of boots under false pretences and was sentenced to 4 months in prison with hard labour. Mary Simmy of Sunderland was found guilty of having obtained some cigars and 2 pounds of tea under false pretences and was sentenced to 2 months in prison with hard labour. And James Evans of South Shields was found guilty of stealing a silver watch and a coat, and he was sentenced to just 5 months in prison without hard labour. The last one seems quite lenient compared to the 2 people before, whose crimes had been over lesser items than the ones James had stolen. William McLaren of Sunderland was charged with having attacked his own son with an iron rod and a heated bottle with intent to do him grievous bodily harm. It seems his son, who was not named, had worked for him and had been fighting with another boy. William had separated them once, but they had begun to fight again. This had angered William very much, and he had struck out at his son. He stated that he had hit him accidentally. However, others who had seen the incident take place stated that he had clearly hit him on purpose. The doctor stated that William's son had been badly injured, and for several days he had been afraid that the boy may die. However, he had now recovered. The jury found William guilty, and the judge spoke to him, stating that this was a terrible crime, one which made his blood run cold. To inflict such a wound on his own child was truly terrible. He then sentenced William to 18 months penal servitude with hard labour. And I think we can be fairly certain that William would have thought twice about doing such a thing again, as imprisonment with hard labour was a very tough punishment for any man, and 18 months was a long time to serve. Edmund Ebdy and Andrew West, both of Durham, were charged with having stolen £9, a silver watch and some copper from the home of Edward McCable. 2 of Edmund's brothers had also been involved in the crime, however they had not been charged. It was suggested that Edmund's father had taken these items to Mr. McCable's house, who was his son-in-law, and in doing so had left his own family almost destitute, and they were simply seeking revenge. The defence said they had wanted the items back to support their own mother. However, it was then stated that Edmund's father had been at Mr. McCable's home when the items were stolen, and Andrew West, who had been paid to go to the home with the other men, had attacked him. The judge said this was a bad case and he did not intend to be lenient. He then sentenced both men to 6 months penal servitude with hard labour. Now, I have to admit that I feel with this case it was possible that they did originally just plan to steal the money and items back to help Edmund's mother, but finding their father in the house, perhaps they saw red and this led to the attack. And as Andrew West had been paid to go to the house with them, he probably did not care what he did as long as he got his payment, and perhaps Edmund and his unnamed brothers thought that he would face punishment alone. William Hall, Edward Hall and Robert Smith were all charged with having stolen £1 5 from Roger Nedden at Jarrow, and they were also accused of attacking Roger and leaving him quite badly injured. Roger Nedden said he had been out for a drink and was returning home when he saw three men standing by the railway lines. He said one of the men asked if he'd like some company on his walk home, and he said he would. However, Roger said once under the nearby bridge, the man, who he said was Edward Hall, pushed him to the ground and tried to strangle him. He said he was almost free when William Hall appeared and kicked him in the face and body. He said they searched his clothes, then ran off towards Robert Smith. Mr. Nedden said Robert Smith had not joined in the attack, he had just stood by watching. He said once all three men met up, they ran away, leaving him on the ground. It was stated that the three men had later been found in a public house spending money they had not had before, and a policeman who had arrested the men said he heard them confess to the crime when they had been in the cells talking to each other. The defence, however, said that Roger Nedden had been very drunk on the night of the attack, and he had first told people that he had lost nothing at all. He later stated that he had lost money from his coat when he had taken it off to fight with his boss. The defence also added that 18 months prior to this attack, Roger Nedden had been picked up drunk and penniless and had claimed to have been robbed. This, he said, had turned out to be completely untrue. The judge spoke to the jury, stating that he put no faith in Roger Nedden's evidence, clearly stating that he did not believe anything the man had said. He also did not seem to take any notice of the police officer who claimed to hear the men confess to the crime. The jury, with barely any discussion, found all three prisoners not guilty, and they were free to leave. George Lamb, who was 19 years old and from Durham, was charged with having stolen 15 shillings from William Marshall. He was also accused of assaulting William. It was stated that William and a friend named Mr. Bell had been out drinking in Durham. They had come into contact with George and some other men just before they headed for home. As they left, George and the other men began to throw stones at them. A fight then took place and William and Mr. Bell were knocked to the ground. Mr. Bell was able to get up and run away, but William was not as lucky. George and the three other men attacked him, stole his money and returned to the public house. William reported the crime to the police, but only George had been found and arrested. The jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to 8 months penal servitude with hard labour, and it was added that the other men were known to the police and it was hoped they would soon be found and charged for the same crime. George Mackay of Durham was charged with stabbing Robert Drysdale with intent to do grievous bodily harm. The two men had been drinking together on New Year's Eve and had argued over a work matter, and Robert had been thrown out of the pub for striking George. Later the two men met in the street and Robert dared George to fight him. The fight was quite a bad one, and when George realised he was losing, he had taken a pair of scissors from his coat and had stabbed Robert in the arm and chest with them. It was said that the wounds were not dangerous and no life had been in danger, and the judge stated that he felt this was nothing more than common assault. The jury then found George guilty of this very charge. The judge stated that as he had been in custody since the start of the year, he would only sentence him to 14 days penal servitude with hard labour, and that he would also be bound over to keep the peace for 3 years at the cost of £100. The final case I am going to cover this week is that of Anthony Liddell of South Shields, who was charged with having stolen more than £40 from a publican by the name of John Gray. It was stated that while in the public house, Anthony had had every opportunity to steal the money, but he had not been seen doing so. When he left, the money had been missed. It was said that Anthony had been out of work for some time, yet after the money had gone missing, he had gone to Sunderland and had been seen carrying a lot of money. He had also hidden some of the money at a house he had previously lodged at, having told the owner of the house that he simply wanted some papers from a chest he had left there for safekeeping, and this was where the money was found in a bag, which had been identified as the bag stolen from John Gray. Identified, I might add, by his daughter because of a certain kind of knot that the bag had been tied with. Although the evidence did not seem to be all that clear, the judge stated the case was full of suspicion against Anthony Liddell. And the jury, who did not retire, quickly found Anthony guilty, and the judge sentenced him to transportation for 10 years. Now, this to me seems incredibly harsh, as although he was accused of stealing the money, he did not confess to it, he was not seen stealing it, and the evidence of the knot in the bag seems to be very little to find a man guilty of. Although, of course, his sudden wealth would have been another factor, but it still seems to me that the crime was not fully proven. I do hope that you have enjoyed these short little snippets of some of the 100 cases that were heard in Durham in that one spring week in 1843. I think it shows how the sentences that were given out to people could be wildly different in very similar cases, and they could range from people being set free when they may well have actually been guilty to people being sentenced to transportation in a case with very sparse evidence. Why did the sentences vary so much? It seems to me that the judges just decided as they went along with no clear rules as to what sentence each crime should be given. For example, why was a young boy to be whipped for stealing a pair of boots when a man who stabbed his workmate was only given 14 days in prison? Though granted, he had been in prison for around 3 months at that point, but it still feels like no sentence at all for the crime he committed compared to that of the young boy William Hartley. So what do you think of these cases? Do you think some were let off too lightly and others were given too harsh a sentence? Do you think it was right that a man who stabbed someone was given less than 5 months, including his time in custody, and another man was transported for 10 years for stealing money? Can you understand how these sentences were worked out? Or do you think there were no rules to follow and the judges simply made it up as they went along? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As said at the start of this video, it is a bit different to others, and I just thought I would try this kind of thing out to see what you all thought of it. And if you did enjoy it and you would like to hear some more like this every now and then do please let me know in the comments below. But for now though, I do hope you did find this video interesting, and I do hope to see you all again next week.